when you disagree with someone, very rarely do you say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm glad we had this argument. Usually what happens is you leave the room and you're like, you know what, my ego couldn't concede that point in the argument, but they have a point, right? And that's how dialogue happens. We plant seeds. We don't know whether they're going to bear fruit. We can't control the harvest, but we can control how we sow.
That was Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City, a major center of conservative Judaism. Ordained in 2008, Rabbi Cosgrove also holds a PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Most recently, he has published For Such a Time as This on Being Jewish Today, a book that inspired a series of speakers at the Toby Center for Jewish Studies on the pressing questions of Jewish identities today. How can contemporary Jews make meaning from ancient texts? How can Jews confront the circumstances that seek to divide them, by their politics toward Israel and Zionism, by their national identities as Israeli or American Jews, by their generational contexts? I'm Shana Hammerman, and this is Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode of Cite and Sound, Rabbi Cosgrove joins Professor of Education and Director of the Concentration in Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford, Ari Kelman, to think about how to bridge the forces that divide Jews today and to reminisce about attending Jewish elementary school together. And now, the conversation.
Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. Most importantly, from Elliot's bio, is that he is a graduate of Akiba Academy, Jewish day school in Los Angeles, where we were in the same class from, I think, kindergarten to sixth grade. So it's great to have you back again. And so my first question is, which of your teachers from Akiba Academy left the biggest impression on you? Sarah Zand, Rivka Shaked, or Hermona Margalit?
All right. Hermona Margalit, a dark horse candidate there for Hebrew teachers. First of all, just amazing to see everyone, Pittsburgh, New York, everything to be, it's like a hometown crowd, and it's amazing. And we literally went to elementary school together. And I promise you, like when we were playing like handball in second grade, we never imagined we'd be part of a Jewish studies dialogue together. So it's really, what do I call you, Ari? Or
Ari is.
All right. All right. So
definitely our Hebrew teachers never imagined that.
Yes. I have a theory about that. The more you get kicked out of Hebrew, the faster it springs back. Anyway, I'm giving it to Rivka Shaked, first grade Hebrew teacher. And I actually tell a story because we're on campus and otherwise. For me, I think that the importance, and hopefully for those of you who are students and those of you who one day will have students, of having your shoulder tapped by a non-biological mentor, right? It's one thing for your own parents to do that. And Ari, I'm sure you've had this experience as an educator and as a professor, but for me, it was a Hillel experience. I went to University of Michigan, and I tell the story in the book of a moment in time when I was sort of peripherally involved. I come from a strong Jewish background, but being Jewish was really something that happened when I was home, not when I was on campus. And a man who grew up a grandfatherly figure, Mr. Gendon, passed away my junior year of college. And at that moment, he was the guy who sat next to us in synagogue, who come to our seders as a child growing up because he didn't really have a family of his own. And when he died, and I got that call from Los Angeles, and I figured I should go to the Hillel for the very first time, because I should say the memorial prayer, Kaddish, over Mr. Gendon. And I was doing it. I had no intention to stick around. I didn't want anything to do with Hillel on campus. And as I'm walking like right to the door, this man boxes me out and stops me from leaving. And I'm like trying to get away. And he says, I notice you've never been here before. And I'm thinking, well, he has an astute sense of the obvious. I only found out about this service, a little while ago. And he said, well, I'd like to invite you over for a Shabbat meal, for Shabbat dinner. And I lied because there was a $1 pitcher night at the local bar. And I said, I already have plans. And he said something then that changed my life, which was, well, I bet you don't have plans for next week. And I was caught. And I said, no. And he said, good, you'll come next week. And then I sort of got involved in the Hillel on campus. I got involved in Jewish studies. I went to rabbinical school. I went to get my PhD. And to make a long story short, here I am today. But I often think about it as a Jewish educator, as a rabbi, as a teacher, right? That ability to look around a room and see that person who's a little out of place, who's not quite at home, and just doing that human thing of reaching out and saying, hi, I notice you've never been here before. It can change a life.
So speaking of changing lives, the title of the book is For Such a Time as This, which is a reference to a line in the Megillah from Purim. But I think it was hard to look at the book when I first saw it, look at the title and not think about this time, not that time. So what do you hope your book does for readers at this time?
So the title of the book comes, if you're familiar, we just celebrated the Jewish holiday of Passover, but before that, it was the festival of Purim. And the Jewish community in ancient Persia believed themselves to be at ease, comfortably living their Persian life and their Jewish life in a diaspora community. And I use this sort of as a spine of the book that's analogous to our own American Jewish moment, that we thought we were balancing our hyphenated lives as Americans, as Jews. And then in the biblical story, the wicked decree of Haman comes down and the fate of the Jewish people is on the line. And at the moment of destiny, when Queen Esther, who has hidden herself in the palace, hidden her Jewish identity, risen up to the highest ranks of queen, her uncle Mordecai reaches out to her and says, you're not going to escape the wicked decree of Haman upon the Jews, and who knows if it was not for such a time as this that you've arrived at your station in life. And Esther rises up as a woman and as a queen, and most of all as a proud Jew, and the Jewish people are saved. So with that as the wind-up, Ari, I think what happened post-October 7th, and the book isn't really, there's a little bit about politics in Israel, but it's mostly about American Jewry in the wake of October 7th. And I suggest that everyone needs to have that Esther moment, right? Some people talk about October 7th Jews, some people talk about the Great Awakening, some people talk about a tribal moment, whatever label you want to put on it, but that we ask ourselves, what can we do in this moment? And the answer is going to be different for everyone. For me, it was advocacy, it was philanthropy. It's actually changed today. I feel like I play a different function. I wrote the book, but we'll get into this, a toxic discourse within the Jewish community. I feel my Esther moment is to try to sort of be a bridge between the crazy right and the crazy left. But I think that if we were to go around the room, right, we've tried to find our voices to respond, right, whether that's activism, whether that's volunteerism, whether that's acts of solidarity, whether that is living a more assertive Jewish life. Many people have turned towards faith during this time. So there have been all sorts, but everyone should have an answer to that question of what your Esther moment is.
So I wonder if I could just follow on that a little bit. I think there's a lot of people who think of themselves as trying to, I don't know if it's threading that needle or perhaps the aperture's a little wider between the crazies on one side and the crazies, or the people who we view as crazies, to our right and to our left. And I think about the chapter about Maya, which I think is probably the chapter you get asked the most about. And you can explain what that chapter is, but I wonder how you would have who the Mayas are, who are the inverse of Maya in your life, and what your conversations are like with them.
The inverse of Maya's?
Meaning they're to your right as opposed to the Maya who's to your left, politically.
Yeah. So we're sort of jumping with the question, but let's go where the heat is, to a moment in time where the Jewish community felt very traumatized, not only by the acts of October 7th, perpetrated not just against Israelis, but actually perceived to be acts against Jews globally, crimes against humanity, period. And when you are traumatized like that, the natural move is to be shields up, right? I think that's whenever anyone, experiences pain and loss, right? And that's a very natural human response. The problem with that is that it can be, any reaction taken to its extreme can be altogether unhealthy, right? So when traumatized, when believing that the world is out to get you, and which I think objectively is true, those who perpetrated October 7th have said that they would do it again and again and again if given the opportunity to do so, but that doth not make every person critical of Israel and anti-Semite. And so the people on the far right see any daylight between the stated policies of the government of Israel and American Jewry to be a betrayal of the cause. And I think that is an overreaction. I think, and we can get to this in the Maya chapter, I think we all woke up to this morning, what's going on with the Harvard campus and the Trump administration, where you see anti-Semitism being weaponized for other political purposes right now. I, for one, am, as a rabbi, not surprisingly, deeply invested in the well-being and the safety of Jewish students. I also feel that when that concern is used for ulterior political motives, I think that it can have very scary consequences. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but there's a lot there.
Do you want to just give a brief summary of that chapter? Because I have another question about it.
So there's a chapter in this about a young woman named Maya. That's not her actual name. She grew up in my household. There's something very personal about the book. I'm the father of 4 college-age or thereabout students. And so this book in many ways is my dialogue with my own children on this. And one of the chapters is about a young woman who grew up in my household who kind of confronted me and said, Rabbi Cosgrove, I notice you have an Israeli flag on your pulpit. I notice you do the prayer for the state of Israel in the services at Park Avenue Synagogue, but being Jewish is different than, affirmation of sovereignty, and my progressive Jewish values are not simpatico with the policies of the state of Israel. And so the question is how to create space for the Mayas, and I model out that conversation, the sort of figurative Mayas at our table, the Gen Z non-Zionist members of the Jewish community. So that's sort of the setup.
Perfect. So I know on our campus and other campuses, the Mayas, and I'll just sort of use them as a metaphor. What would you tell, and that chapter is really moving, but what would you tell them that might encourage them to step into a Hillel or step into a Jewish studies classroom where they feel like their politics sort of prevent them from doing so, whether that's actual or not, but they don't feel comfortable because of the political divide? What would you do to encourage them to take some of the steps that you extend to her in that chapter, where you're like, your voice is important, we need you more than ever?
Well, first of all, is not to blame someone for believing what they believe in. I think that as I look at sort of the first few rows here of the room, there was a philosopher, Valéry, who said that everyone is destined to live in the time into which they are born. Right? You can't blame someone for when they were born. And so if you were born post-2000, the only prime minister you know of in Israel is Netanyahu. The only policy you have is a policy of West Bank expansionism that renders a two-state solution dead on arrival. The only paradigm you have is a paradigm of Israel as a Goliath to the Palestinian David. These are not invented. This is the reality as perceived by a Gen Z student. And then not to mention the fact that I'm a conservative rabbi, so you have a Jewish expression that's not sanctioned by the Israeli government, the very government that was a constitutive part of my religious identity. My daughter, who some of you know, right, I use this in the book as an example, went off to Israel for a gap year in between high school and college and spent a year surrounded by secular Tel Aviv Israelis and realized over the course of that year that a typical secular Israeli expends zero psychic energy on the condition of diaspora Jewry. And she felt very deflated, like she had been sold a false bill of goods, Jewish camping, Jewish day school, kid of a rabbi, Israel part of her identity. And then she realized that she loved something more than it loved her back. And then you have the chutzpah, if you're familiar with that word, to put that kid on a northeastern liberal college campus where they are positioned to defend the government policies of the very place that doesn't care about them and doesn't represent their progressive Jewish identity. Okay, so people often make a mistake by saying, well, the Mayas they're not informed well, they don't care about their Judaism, well, we got to write them up. I actually think the Mayas of the world are some of the best informed. And then you tell them that you can't protest the Netanyahu government when you turn on the television or check the webpage and you see tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting the Netanyahu government as an expression of their love of country. And so the math doesn't add up, right? Why is what is treif not kosher in America altogether kosher, right? I protest the American government as a statement of my patriotism. Why can't I protest the Israeli government as a statement of my love of country? And so we've arrived in this moment of time where I think, one, a self-correction is needed by what I jokingly call the OJC, the Organized Jewish Community. And we can get to this, but I think at a certain moment, Zionism became confused with Judaism and Judaism with Zionism. And that's a mistake. We have to have a Jewish expression that is inclusive and expansive of a range of expressions, at least as wide as the range of expressions that are sanctioned in Israeli society. And you have to be able to ask a good question, right? Okay, Maya, you don't believe in a sovereign state of Israel. Okay. All right, but last I checked, there's Hezbollah in the north. They were 540 plus days of captives as hostages. You have Hamas, you have Iran, you have Houthis, right? You have real existential threats. Okay, what's your answer? What's your answer? 47% of the global Jewish people live in that place called Israel. How are you going to solve that place that is facing real existential threats from enemies who would destroy it? Do the most important thing of all at that time is what I recommend in the book. Shut up. Just stop talking. Let that mind articulate an answer that is somehow able to integrate all of the progressive sensibilities and objections to the Netanyahu government and their policies, but also be eyes wide open to the reality of the threats Israel faces. And I don't think debates are won in the moment. It's an act of planting seeds. I don't know if anyone's ever had this. When you disagree with someone, very rarely do you say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm glad we had this argument. Usually what happens is you leave the room and you're like, you know what, my ego couldn't concede that point in the argument, but they have a point, right? And that's how dialogue happens. We plant seeds. We don't know whether they're going to bear fruit. We can't control the harvest, but we can control how we sow.
Do you have the same strategy when talking with people on the other end of the political spectrum?
I have been accused of being an enabler for a genocidal government, and I've been accused of being treasonous against the Jewish people. So in that sense, whatever, like I feel like I'm doing something right. So to take because we're on a college campus, to take what's going on college campus, right, to sort of say, look, you might feel that it's long overdue that someone threw an elbow on college campuses, right? I personally have no I will not shed a tear if anti-masking legislation is passed. I think masking is a form of intimidation. Like, I think that, protest free speech is critically important, all the more so on college campuses. And I think that there's a place where that line is crossed. And I think that there's a moment where you cross a line to consequences, not just like little things like free speech, due process, and science research is on the chopping block, but the Jewish community. We're at that time of year that people are admitted to campuses. And I got 2 calls from parents in my community for whom funding hopes have been dashed because at certain campuses there's been a reallocation of funds. I have a colleague in D.C. whose congregation is hemorrhaging because Jews are losing their jobs who are civil servants in D.C. So I don't even have to go to like third level sort of effects of this. The effects of this on the Jewish community are being felt real presently. And I think to kind of say to the right wing of the Jewish community, say, look, I am totally aligned with you on the real threats that Israel faces, the threats that we all lived through last year, that Jewish students and the Jewish community with a porous and pernicious line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But there also has to be a way to defend ourselves without overreach.
So I wonder, you said before that the book is about American Jews' relationship to Israel, and I agree that's sort of like the main theme. And you have this great metaphor where you describe the relationship between American Jews and Israel as clumsy dance partners who keep stepping on each other's toes. What would be, apart from maybe dance partners that don't step on each other's toes, what's the metaphor that you imagine for that relationship, especially given your daughter's experience of having spent time there, only to discover that Israelis don't think about American Jews nearly as much as American Jews think about Israelis?
Look, I think American Jewry has a tremendous amount to teach Israel about, this is me, an American rabbi, but about pluralism, about multiple expressions of Jewish faith, about the separation of religion and state. I think that many of the excesses and dangerous elements of Israeli Judaism are that there's no separation between church and state in Israel. And so religion is militarized by the most extreme elements, or you have, so my sister-in-law's Israeli boyfriend was at my dinner table last night, and he said that he observes absolutely nothing because any expression of religion is seen as a concession to the most right-wing element. If you came of age when Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing religious zealot, that is something that any expression of organized religion is anathema to a large subgroup of Israel. But he also said, the only hope that Israeli Judaism has is active dialogue with American Jewish expressions, because those are certainly not being given the light of day in Israel. So I would say some sort of, everyone's familiar with birthright and things like that. Like if there could be a form of birthright and reverse birthright that the various communities, right? You got 47% of global Jewry in Israel. You got about the same here, a few percentage points in Europe and South America, but those are the two, right? If there could be sort of active bridge building that goes on between the two, that we can take the best of the two and inform each other and recognize each other, how that happens, we need people smarter than me and you, but I think that bridge building is very important.
Do you think the Israeli Jews are on board with that idea? I understand that to me is very diaspora Jewish idea. Do you think the Israelis are on board?
Right now, no. It's interesting. There are Israelis in the room, so I would defer to Israelis. I think right now, post October 7th, I think there's a moment of trauma. There's a moment of we have to take care of our own front yard right now. So on the one hand, these pesky diaspora Jews are not really, part of the solution. We might even be part of the problem. On the other hand, I've experienced in the last sort of 15, 16, however many months we've been in this war, some really profound moments of a sense of the bomb, BALM, for sort of Israel's loneliness on the world stage, that American Jews' voice of support can be critically important. I don't know how that sort of, I'll let our moderator moderate, but, it's, yeah.
I think on that same score, you come up really strong at some point in the book, sort of pro two-state solution. But it's my understanding that neither Israelis nor Palestinians at this moment, but also kind of in the last, 5, 10 years, have really entertained that as a serious idea, in part because of the policies and so on. So how do you balance this commitment toward this idea with a vision of Israel as a sovereign democratic state and your responsibility to Israel? Is it just to be a kind of counter voice from the diaspora in the way that you're talking about? Or because I have other people in my life who are like, why do American Jews keep harping on this if it's not what the Jewish Israelis want, to say nothing of what the Palestinians might want?
So look, first of all, I need to name my biases or my points of reference. Just like I said earlier, that you can't blame a person for when they were born. I came of age as, in that early 90s Oslo sort of moment, a scrappy possibility of maybe there could be a two-state solution. So that's become my sort of orthodoxy. And so when people say, just leave it, it's done, the moment has passed, it's very hard for me to leave that moment. I try in my objectivity to be both morally and pragmatically my commitment to a two-state solution, as a Jew, as a Zionist, the project of the state of Israel is Jewish self-determination over Jews, and not to interfere with another people's right to that self-same determination. No one knows better, Exhibit A, the Passover Seder, what it is to be a stranger in a strange land than the Jewish people. We should know the heart of a stranger. For me, that's sort of the Torah of what it means to be a Jew. I also think that pragmatically speaking, independent of what people in this room may or may not feel about Israel's Palestinian neighbors, I think the only path to having maybe not peace, but side-by-side coexistence and shared society is two peoples able to hang their hats and call a place home. I think that's a pipe dream right now. I think that there's so much distrust. I think that the victims of October 7th were from the Israeli left. These were folk who had given their lives and careers to try to build shared society. There is such a sense of, I was in Israel twice so far this year, even those who are anti-government, who are saying, I want a deal right now, bring the hostages back. It's very interesting. In America, to say bring the hostages home is seen as a pro-Israel statement. In Israel, to say bring the hostages home now is seen as an anti-government statement. It's just very interesting the way these things don't and do sometimes match up on either side of the ocean. But I think that the idea of a two-state solution is not a viable one right now. But I also think that as long as Jews have been Jews, we have sought, worked for, desired, aspired towards a reality that whether we do or don't realize it in our lifetime, it remains our bar of aspiration, right? When the Jews left Egypt, they weren't going to make it to the promised land, but they kept working towards that. When the Jews were in exile in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and elsewhere, they aspired for a return to the land. For 2,000 years, we prayed, we said next year in Jerusalem at our Seder tables, we broke glasses at Jewish weddings, we prayed in the direction of Jerusalem, whether or not we were going to return. So I think that there is something very, very Jewish and altogether okay about working towards something, whether or not we're going to realize it in our lifetime or not. I think that a differentiated place of diaspora Jewry, given the fact that we're not in the military, not paying taxes, not voting in Israel, I think we can be that prophetic voice to say this remains the ideal, even if, unfortunately, it may not happen in our lifetimes.
I think one of the things you do so beautifully in the book is that you weave together elements of the Jewish textual tradition, sometimes the biblical tradition or the Megillot, and sometimes the ritual tradition, like in Passover, and sometimes from modern Jewish thought. And I'm struck again by the title of the book, From Purim, even though we're in the middle of Pesach. I really tried to come up with a good Pesach question, and I couldn't. So I'm going to ask a Purim question instead. There's enough questions in Passover. So Peter Beinart, who's going to be here in a few weeks, wrote this other book. And one of the things that he does in that book is he picks on the Purim story. He picks on it as an example of a kind of narrative, a Jewish narrative that's sort of run its course. And he uses it as a call for new Jewish narratives. And you use it in a very different way. And so I wonder if Peter, whom you probably have met at some point, were to come to Park Avenue for Purim and sit and listen to the Megillah. What's the part of the Megillah that you want him to hear differently than what he's able to hear, sort of the way he uses it in his book? Like, what's the message that you want him to get from the Purim Megillah, or maybe from the Purim story more generally, that you think might sow the seeds for moving his mind a little bit?
Okay, so full disclosure, while I have a relationship with Peter, I unfortunately, and maybe I'll read it on the plane, I haven't read his book. So if you're familiar with the Megillah, just to open it up so people can respond and be part of it, is at the very end, yay, Jews are saved, we're all eating Hamantaschens. And then in the later chapters, there's actually this very dark, vengeful, a colleague of ours, David Beale, is that right? He wrote a book. It's sort of this ritual fantasy of an oppressed people, of what they would do if given the chance to exact revenge over their would-be persecutors. And it's gory stuff. Tens of thousands of non-Jews killed at the Jewish hand, which is really uncomfortable. It's really dark stuff, and you should read it. It's not the thing that we teach kids in Hebrew school, but it's there in the Megillah, and I think Peter Beinart would say we have to name this part in our tradition too. It is why, and I tell this story in my book, because I was living in Israel at the time, Baruch Goldstein, who went into the cave of the matriarchs and patriarchs in the early 90s and killed 29 Muslim worshippers, he chose to do it on the festival of Purim because he didn't read that story as some sort of fantasy idea. He read that story as an actual commandment of what a Jew must do when they can exact revenge on their would-be enemies. It's really disgusting stuff. Its ideology is associated with someone named Meir Kahane, whose ideology was outlawed under the government of Yitzhak Shamir in the 80s. And Shamir, just so you know, was a right-wing prime minister. So the fact that he said this is beyond the pale of discourse is a significant statement. P.S. That Kahanist ideology has not only now been mainstream back in, but is actually in positions of power in some political parties without whom Netanyahu would not have a coalition of power. And so what was like beyond not kosher is now actually sitting in the minister of police in Israel. So Beinart is not wrong to say, look at what happens. Look at the underbelly. Vigilance for the Jewish self is one thing, but when that vigilance turns into vengeance and is militarized, that is very, very scary. And so again, I think this is where we need to find that way to be unapologetic about defending Israel's right to self-defense and self-determination, but also realize that some of the biggest enemies that we have as a Jewish people are not out there, but actually within the Jewish body politic, both textually, like in the book of Esther, but also in sitting in the seats of the Knesset.
Well, I do have one more question, which is there a text or an object or a quote that you are holding on to and sort of turning over in your mind as you're making it through the contemporary moment? Like, what's getting you through?
So I'm not going to go too deep. I'm going to go Passover. At a Passover Seder, if you remember the Sesame, I don't know if you ever saw Sesame Street as a kid, but like, which of these things do not belong here? Who is a person at the Passover Seder that doesn't quite belong? Elijah, right? You would think Moses fine, Aaron fine, Miriam fine, like all part of the Exodus. Why do we welcome Elijah, the prophet, at a Seder table? And there's a passage that associated with Elijah from the prophetic reading that we just read this past Shabbat in synagogue, that it says that when Elijah comes, he will be Meshiv lev avot al banim belev banim al avotam, that Elijah signals the turning of hearts of parents to their children and children to their parents, that liberation happens when there's this sort of ability to be in dialogue all together. And I think for me, we're not even 48 hours out of the Passover Seder, that ability to be in dialogue, to disagree without being disagreeable, to hear someone else's uncomfortable truth even as you're asserting your own. I think that's what this world is lacking right now. For me, that's what my Esther moment is to try to figure out a way to embrace the complexities of this hour without tearing ourselves up from within. And so I keep thinking about my hope to hear the redemptive voice of Elijah in this time.
Please join me in thanking Rabbi Cosgrove.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, along with Eva Clem and Nilo Farsaraj. Sound design by Romy Chikorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.